right, so we're back at the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have Matt McManus, who writes books, most notably The Emergence of Postmodernity at the Intersection of Liberalism, Capitalism, and Secularism. And next month he has The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism coming out. And even more importantly, has an article coming out in our Substack on Cracks and Pomo. So Matt, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. I'm glad we finally got a chance to talk.
Absolutely. So before we talk about the article that we're publishing by you, can you just give listeners a little bit of your own background, some of your story, so they can get to know you better?
Sure. Well, I'm Canadian. Grew up in and around Ottawa for the most part. I started becoming interesting in the discourse around modernity and postmodernity, if you want to call it that, when I was doing my undergrad. Actually, the people who got me interested in that were mainly my very conservative-leaning professors. I say interestingly because I'm definitely a left-winger now. But they were very intrigued by people like George Grant, who some of your listeners might know, very famous, kind of high Tory Canadian political theorist. Leo Strauss, big influence on a lot of them. Martin Heidegger, very important. And I kind of absorbed a lot of that and filtered it through my own lenses. And later on, even as I shifted more to the left and started reading people like, say, for instance, Fred Jameson, who passed away recently, I retained that interest. And the product of all those years reading opaque postmodern theory is the book that you just mentioned, The Emergence of Postmodernity.
So, okay, so I want to get into this article that you wrote for us, kind of looking at both left-leaning and right-leaning critiques of modernity and postmodernity. Um, so I find it interesting. This is kind of building on something you wrote in Jacobin, but you include some stuff about Alistair McIntyre. And I was kind of surprised that you put him on the left. I mean, I know that in After Virtue, yes, like he talks about Marx in a fairly positive, measuredly positive light. So I want to start there. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on McIntyre and his critique of modernity.
Sure. Well, the reason I became interested in McIntyre is because I was raised Roman Catholic. I drifted away from the church for a variety of different reasons, although I do still have my own religious convictions about this. But he really intrigued me as somebody who offered a very cogent, very powerful, and very passionate critique of modernity and Enlightenment. And I became kind of fascinated with him. I guess maybe I'm partway through my master's degree. It's been so long right now, right? But broadly speaking, we can kind of divide McIntyre's work into three distinct periods, right? The first period that's probably best embodied by his minor classic, Marxism and Christianity, is when he worked as fairly conventional Marxist Christian. If that sounds a little bit unusual, it's not nearly as unusual as people outside the United States might think, right? So you go to Germany, where there's a very robust Christian democratic, social democratic tradition, or Latin America with liberation theology. We don't have to list all the examples. But in Marxism and Christianity, he more or less reached the conclusion that Marxism carried forward what was best in the ethos of Christianity, indeed, in many cases, even the metaphysics of Christianity, with its critique of idolatry, for example, that was kind of re-articulated as critique of fetishism and reification. And McIntyre didn't quite say that we don't need Christianity any longer, but he did suggest that the kind of Marxist critique of idolatrous forms of Christianity and reactionary forms of Christianity was entirely apt, right? And so if we were going to carry forward with a kind of Christian ethos, it would need to be heavily filtered through this kind of Marxist lens, right? So that changed starting, for McIntyre at least, I would argue, starting in the 1970s, when he became really dissatisfied by the New Left for a number of different reasons. Probably the best place to go and investigate that would be his short little book, Marcuse. I'm guessing at least a few of your listeners probably know who Marcuse is, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. The godfather of the New Left, author of One Dimensional Man. Not a very fair book, I should say. I'd actually say it's probably McIntyre's worst piece of writing, if you just take it as a critique of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. But what does come through in this book is his dissatisfaction with this kind of bohemian new left attitude that he sees emerging out of what we call distortions of the Frankfurt School. And he decides that this has nothing to do with kind of working class activism anymore, kind of trying to create a new society that'll be beneficial to the poor. And he starts to drift away from it for that reason, right? And I have a little bit more sympathy to that more political critique of the kind of things that emerge from Marcusean theory or Frankfurt School theory than I do his critique of the theory itself. But the big showstopper, of course, is his book After Virtue, which is the one that everybody is probably familiar with, right? So originally, he was apparently going to write another pretty standard text of Marx's theory and apocryphally tore it up and decided to start over from scratch again because he came convinced that most Marxists, when they were trying to make normative arguments, which itself, I should say, is controversial from a Marxist standpoint, invariably just kind of relapsed or reduced themselves down to becoming pretty stock and trade utilitarians or Kantians, basically borrowing prestige from other moral traditions. And so in this book, he tries to account for a lot of different things, amongst them, why? Why did that happen to Marxism and indeed a lot of other Enlightenment era traditions? And as anybody who reads After Virtue knows, his conclusions are extraordinarily bleak, right? I mean, the book ends with the claim that the barbarians aren't even at the gates, they are within right now and probably tearing up society as we speak. So it's way too complicated to summarize everything about After Virtue right here. We need to have several talks about it. But the main thing that I want to foreground is his critique of modernity. We can talk about virtue ethics and that kind of stuff another time if you want. But long story short, McIntyre argues that by dropping the kind of teleologically minded ethical approaches of figures like Aristotle and many of the Christian church fathers, the Enlightenment figures thought they were putting morality and ethics on a more rational basis. These are people like Kant and Bentham, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately they didn't, right? Because all the different kind of alternatives to this Aristotelian Thomistic outlook that have been floated by, Enlightenment figures have turned into dead ends, or worse, they turn into what at least in After Virtue, McIntyre refers to as emotivism, right? This idea that morality is just a matter, for the most part, of subjective taste. The example he gives is ice cream, right? You might not like murder and I may relish murder, right? And you might not be able to understand why I relish murder, but that's just your taste and I have my taste. In the same way, you might like vanilla ice cream and I might like chocolate ice cream, and there's really no way of dialoguing between us in a way that could convince me that my taste is wrong in some way, shape, or form. And in that book, he's not exactly critical of Marx per se. He is very critical of the Marxist tradition, though. He points out that, for the most part, Marxism, which was the long-standing critical tradition in the Western world that tried to offset the kind of worst impulses of consumer society and liberalism, has wound up more or less in the same dead ends as all of those traditions. That's because it shares in this kind of Enlightenment heritage. And he is wary of moving in a more conservative direction, and this is why I push against him as interpreting him, even in this period, as a man of the right. So his book makes an argument for the importance of tradition, yes, but he makes it very clear at the conclusion of After Virtue that, in his terms, a tradition that becomes Burkean or conservative is already dead, right? And he characterizes any kind of reactionary interpretation of the story
Yeah.
he's talking about as ideologically motivated in the Marxist pejorative sense of the term, right? Then in the third period that we can talk about, I know I've spoken for a long time, so I'll be very brief, right? In things like whose justice, whose rationality, and ethics in the conflict of modernity, he starts to soften his position on Enlightenment rationalism a little bit. Doesn't quite say it's one moral approach that we might be able to rejuvenate amongst others, but sometimes gestures in that direction. But what was of interest to me in his ethics in the conflict of modernity is how he really comes back to Marx in a very sustained way. And this was already implicit in After Virtue, I'd argue, but what McIntyre makes clear in Ethics of the Conflict of Modernity is that the main reason why emotivism, relativism, subjectivism have become ubiquitous in our society right now isn't because of ethical problems exclusively. It's also because of the ubiquity of capitalism and the kind of cultural ambiance that it creates. And there's good reasons for this, according to McIntyre, right? Think back to the example I gave of emotivism, this idea that the choice between murder and non-murder is the same as a choice between chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream. Well, McIntyre would say the reason people tend to think that way is because we've been brought up in a market society where whether you like chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream is taken to be just a matter of taste, and we kind of extend that outwards to our moral outlooks more generally. And in this book, he points out very powerfully that what Marx had to teach us, this is a paraphrase, we've had to relearn again and again and again, right? And he tries to systematically, and I would say unsuccessfully, integrate Marxism with a kind of left Christian outlook, centered around this idea of not just securing public goods for people, but common goods for people, which will entail a radical rejection of liberalism and capitalism, and a commitment to a much more egalitarian kind of communitarianism. So that's my take on McIntyre for you.
Then what do you make of those right-leaning kind of renderings of McIntyre's thought? Because, like, I mean, I have to say, one of my first kind of forays into McIntyre's work was through Rod Dreher and the Benedict option, which clearly is a right-leaning kind of spin on it. So I don't know, what would you have to say to those types of arguments?
Well, it doesn't really surprise me, right? I mean, I think that there's undoubtedly something that is extraordinarily appealing about McIntyre's work to a right-wing audience, right? And I've seen him cited by everybody from Robert Bork, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners know as the kind of failed Reagan appointee to the Supreme Court, to people like Dreher, to people like Deneen. And what they tend to emphasize, understandably enough, is the importance that McIntyre places on things like tradition, resuscitating, if not teleological Aristotelianism, at least a kind of Aristotelian ethics centered around virtue, and of course his Christianity, right? Because from the beginning, McIntyre always emphasized the importance of Christian traditions to the solidity and sources of meaning in the West, right? Now, where I would be very critical of this right-leaning interpretation of McIntyre is, first off, it runs explicitly against what he himself has said, right? Again, he's always been very overt about his debt to Marx, the fact that he is extremely critical of capitalism and deeply committed to the idea that we need a more egalitarian kind of social order than what we have right now. And I don't really think you see very much of that emphasized in the right-wing interpretations of his work that are kind of foregrounded. And this leads me to a second point, which is there's something that's very disappointing about this, because what makes McIntyre interesting is that he's not just another kind of culture war, modernity is bad type figure, right? He's does definitely think that there are a lot of things about modern culture and modern morality that are debased relative to left Christian alternatives. But he's very insistent that to be a good cultural warrior, you also need to have a very firm understanding of political economy. And indeed, to invoke ethics in the conflict of modernity again, we need to rethink the basic categories of political economy along explicitly Marxist lines, right? And aligned with that, I was about to say Dreher, McIntyre thinks ultimately we should move towards a post-liberal society, yes, but a post-liberal society that would look very different than, say, what Patrick Deneen would put forward. Not a kind of Aristopopulist conservatism, but rather a very egalitarian, highly participatory kind of communal society where people are very willing to lay down their wealth and lay down their advantages to pursue common goods with others, right? Which is inherently kind of an anti-elitist politics.
So then let's bring Taylor into the picture. So tell
Sure.
us a little bit about, because again, I mean, thinking about Dreyer, like he kind of melds the two's ideas in order to like build up this kind of Benedict option. But what do you think is distinct about Taylor's take on modernity?
Well, this is a I just criticized conservatives for their kind of nationalist orientation, and here I'm going to be like, well, he's a good Canadian thinker, and I think people don't actually understand where he comes from in this. Anyway, long story short, there's a long tradition of what's sometimes called left idealism, even left Hegelianism in Canada. That includes, I should say, not just people like Taylor, but also people like, say, C.B. Macpherson, who's been a big influence on me. It's a very rich school of thought that I think deserves more appreciation worldwide. Maybe I write about that sometimes. But anyway, long story short, Charles Taylor is famous for a number of different reasons. He initially became known for providing Hegelianism with a degree of analytical respectability in the English-speaking world, right? You know, Taylor is now in his 90s. When he began writing in the 1960s and 1970s, as many of your listeners probably know, Hegel was pretty much a persona non grata in analytical philosophy, including in analytical political theory, right? If you wanted to study him, you went to Europe, or at least you studied with these kind of nutty continental thinkers who weren't even real philosophers, right? So his first book was an interpretation of Hegel that many people think is flawed, and I would argue that Taylor probably thinks it's flawed at this point, right? But nonetheless was engaging and kind of articulating basic Hegelian themes in the idioms of analytical philosophy that not only made them palatable, but indeed persuasive to many in working in analytic philosophical fields. And I should say he was really a pioneer in that regard, right? Even though I'm not a huge fan of that first Hegel book, people like, say, Robert Brandom, for example, who's probably the most famous American philosopher in the world right now, and explicitly identifies as Hegelian, are kind of carrying on in the spirit, which is the name of Branham's book, of what he was doing, right? But more importantly, Taylor is a kind of left Catholic thinker, always has been. Ran for the New Democratic Party in Canada several times, unsuccessfully, I should add. For those of you who don't know, the New Democratic Party is the Democratic Socialist, Social Democratic Party in Canada, third largest party in the country, usually, right? And from the 1970s onward, he wrote a number of extremely important books on left social theory and also, of course, on philosophy, developing what's sometimes called a communitarian critique of liberalism. And this is actually a good place where I can actually maybe demarcate him a bit from McIntyre. So Taylor's critique of liberalism, again, comes from a kind of distinctly left communitarian perspective, where in his kind of middle period work, he's critical of it for what he calls atomism, right? This kind of anthropological assumption that ultimately society just consists, to use Margaret Thatcher's terms, of individuals and maybe families. And individuals, for the most part, are competitive, acquisitive, and want to look after themselves. And of course, from Hegelian standpoint, Taylor thought that this was just anthropologically deeply wrong, and the kind of societies that were built upon these anthropic assumptions were also deeply flawed for that reason, because they can't adequately fill the social needs that a lot of human beings have. If people want a good take on this, they can just read his classic essay, Atomism, right? Which makes all of this very explicit. Now, by the time we get to his mature period, Taylor starts becoming a lot more friendly to liberalism. Again, particularly in essays like The Politics of Recognition, because he points out that the problem isn't necessarily with liberalism per se, it's with the kind of atomistic assumptions that some forms of liberalism bake into their policy preferences. And probably more importantly, it's, of course, with the effect of economic liberalism. That's the real enemy, right? This kind of neoliberal set of policies that are being endorsed by governments across the world that induce or incentivize people to adopt these type of hyper competitive, hyper commodified attitudes towards everything. Now, by the time we get to the 2000s, I'm sorry, I know I'm long-winded about this. There's a lot to say about this. Taylor starts writing book after book after book that are just gigantic bricks that take a long time to go through, that are very deep, very rich, extremely learned, almost too learned. I know that might seem odd, but he's really one of those guys who's encyclopedic in the way that you'd want a Hegelian to be. But sometimes you're almost like, you could trim these books down to a more punchy kind of weight. But the two most important are his book, A Secular Age, and then the most recent one, excuse me, Cosmic Connection. So A Secular Age is about just what it suggests, how it is that secularism, so-called, became ubiquitous across the Western world. And his argument about this is actually quite surprising, right? So first off, and again, this is where you can see the kind of dialectical relations with a kind of liberalism come through. So he argues that contra the kind of reactionary narrative that liberalism is some bastardization of Christianity or some fall away from Christianity. Actually, Taylor points out that while there are elements of liberalism that are a regression from certain kinds of Christianity, at least, there is no doubt that much of what we take to be liberalism emerged from out of a Christian outlook. And this can go all the way back to people like St. Augustine, for example, right? St. Augustine was one of the first people to really focus on interiority and the inner life as something that is peculiarly important because it allows the individual to form this unique and distinctive relationship with God. And Taylor points out that, of course, Augustine is not a liberal, right? But this emphasis on interiority is later going to go on to influence people like Martin Luther, who is, as many people know, profoundly influenced by St. Augustine. And of course, Luther is going to emphasize very forcefully that it is important for people to be able to manage their faith tradition for themselves as individuals, because if they don't manage their faith tradition for themselves as individuals, but it's excessively mediated by hierarchical institutions, then there's something that is insincere about these faith relations, right? Now, the book goes on at great length to point out how eventually, partly as a result of Protestantism, partly as a result of spreading scientific norms, and partly as a result of some other factors, there was a kind of secular mindset that emerged that aligned itself with these forms of individualism that ultimately emerged out of Christianity. And some of those forms of individualism are very bad, right? They lead to things like neoliberalism, egoism, etc., etc. But Taylor is actually quite fond of what he sometimes calls expressive individualism. Now, he criticizes it in A Secular Age for a number of good reasons, but he also points out that this emphasis on authenticity that really comes to the fore in the 19th century in figures like Kierkegaard, but also in people like, say, John Stuart Mill, uh,
Mhm.
can be pushed in very vulgar, very egoistic directions. But it also reflects this real yearning on the part of people to have a spirituality that means something to them as individuals,
Yeah.
and to not have to conform to social forms of religion that are imposed upon them and which they go through the motions of expressing adherence to, even though it means nothing to them. And in his famous critique of reactionary approaches to expressive individualism and authenticity in a secular age, he says, yeah, some people might prefer a homogenous society committed to a nationalist religious outlook because I think that would be less alienating. But the enormous price that you pay for that is you might have 10 million Catholics, so called, and many of them go through the motions and don't believe a thing of what they're saying, right? And this Kierkegaard himself could not put that better, right? When he points out that in a world with a billion Christians, it's very possible that, or sorry, billion people adhering to Christendom, it's very possible that you might not be able to find a single real Christian because everybody is just imbibing this compromised iteration of Christendom because they don't want the real deal of Christianity. So that brings us to a secular age, but I've been talking for a long time right now. So I'll pause right here. And if you want to talk about cosmic connections, we can get into that in a few minutes.
Well, no, so now I want to kind of go to the flip side. The kind of right wing critique of modernity that you say, I mean, you say that the left wing one doesn't fall into kind of this simplistic nostalgia, this reactionary, wanting to return, as they say. There's something more sophisticated about it. So if you can kind of summarize what you say about the right wing critique and then why you find it to be less compelling than the left-leaning one.
Sure. Well, I mean, part of that is just due to my own political convictions, right? I'm not going to lie and say that there's not a partisan angle to this, although I do have reasons for those convictions, right? That we don't need to get into. It's good. That'll take us far away. The kind of critique that I make of these right-wing accounts of modernity and post-modernity is that they tend to be monological, right? So I already gave two examples, McIntyre and Taylor, one of left critiques, right? And one of the things that's exemplary about both of their works is that they stress that there are real benefits to modernity that we shouldn't sacrifice if we want to go about engaging in return, right? McIntyre is very insistent that there is no return to Aristotelianism and scholasticism unadulterated, right? Because the metaphysical foundations of Aristotelianism and scholasticism, whatever Pat Deneen or Peter Lawler might want, are gone, right? Like you're not going to be arguing for an intrinsic teleology to nature any longer in front of a bunch of people who are committed to studying quantum theory, right? So if you are going to resuscitate the Aristotelian project, you're going to need to do so in a very unique way that's probably going to be quite unfaithful to Aristotle or Aquinas, and it's going to involve, in McIntyre's case, an awful lot of Marx, right? And also respect for the glories is the only way to put it of modernity, right? He's very fond of people like D.H. Lawrence, et cetera, who he thinks would only emerge in a modern context. Taylor, it's even more explicit, right? I gave account of his discussion of atomism and how he's very critical of the modern age for bringing about these kinds of neoliberal forms of egoistic individualism. But he's also quite admiring of the more expressive forms of individualism, even though he has some criticisms of those as well, that can only emerge in the kind of egalitarian context that is brought about by the advent of liberal modernity, right? By contrast, reactionary critiques of modernity are much more kind of one-sided in just saying that for the most part it's bad, right? We've seen regression from a previous period of auspician, meaning, residence, to the modern world, which is characterized by decline, decadence, and fall. And the only way to go about offsetting that is, as the meme goes, through some kind of return, right? Now, I do not want to imply in any way, shape, or form that even though these narratives are monological, that they are somehow crude or implausible, right? Reactionary critics of modernity have had some very insightful things to say about the nature of modernity. So I'll just give two examples, right? Martin Heidegger, right? Very, very important figure on the far right. Nazi, right? Let's just be straightforward about that. Rightly criticized for that by pretty much everyone. Well, not everyone, a lot of people across the political spectrum, right? But there's no denying that when he puts forward this argument, starting in being in time, but progressing forward, that we tend to be oriented by clock time when we live in urban spaces, which means we tend to think in time in terms of this minute passing into this minute, passing into this minute, and focusing on what I'm doing at each point in that. This kind of extracts the individual from the more holistic versions of time in which he thinks we should be integrated, namely ecstatic time. Because an ecstatic integration into time would mean that we'd appreciate how everything that we are doing in the present is very much determined by who we are in the past, not just ourselves as individuals, right, but as members of a broader world, right? And also, what we're doing in the present is extremely influenced, oddly enough, by the future, right? Our hopes, our expectations that are projected forward. The way that I usually explain this is in terms of a hockey game, because I'm Canadian, right? You probably are really focused on passing the puck to your teammate when you're playing hockey, and you might think that you're really living in the present. But every kind of motion that you go for draws upon reservoirs of past experience, not just on your part, but over generations. And of course, you're projecting expectations about what you're going to do, how the past is going to go, whether you're going to be able to score into the future, right? And Heidegger argues that these kinds of integrative approaches to time become very difficult in a world dominated by clock time, right? Because we all tend to think that the most important thing is to live in the moment, right? Don't think too much about the future. Don't think about the past. And if you do that, then it's only going to lead you down the road to being depressed. But Heidegger thinks that there are some good reasons for us to be not necessarily depressed, but anxious about wanting to integrate ourselves into this holism of time, because the reality is that our living in the present is eventually going to stop because at some point we are all going to die, and you're going to run out of moments in which just to in which you can just inhabit in this kind of crude, inauthentic way. And it's only when you start to think about your life holistically that you really begin to ask yourself big questions about the kinds of projects that you want to commit yourself to, and whether the project or you're engaging, or whether the projects that you're engaging in and day out are really all that meaningful to your life or to anyone else's life, right? So there's a lot more to this Heideggerian critique of modernity than what I just kind of emphasized here, but it's a deep one, right? I mean, there's some very intriguing and important things and insights that we can draw from it, and that includes, I should add, people like Taylor, right, who are influenced by editors like Heidegger. And then I'll just mention Peter Lawler, who some of your listeners might not be familiar with, but one of my early books was a book called The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism. It still seems to be the one that everybody likes the best, even though I have some problems with it now. But I did not coin that term. It's been around for a very long time. I actually think Sheldon Wolin is the one who got to it first. But Peter Lawler actually identified as a postmodern conservative, wrote a very interesting book called Postmodernism Rightly Understood, other important books like American Heresies. And the reason he identified as a postmodern conservative, as he said, ultimately, with the advent of modernity, we have left realism behind. Now, that might seem like a very odd thing to say about an age that prides itself on being scientific and scientifically rational, right? But Lawler's point is that what we have lost with the advent of modernity and now postmodernity is this belief in essences or universals, right? We've all become nominalists in a certain sense. When this happened, he kind of has some complicated thoughts on, probably around the scholastic period. But when we stop believing in this idea of universal essences, and we believe that everything is just, to put it simply, Hobbesian matter in motion, then we come to the conclusion that if all we are is matter in motion, then there's no reason that I can't say rework my body into being something very fundamentally different, because there's no essence to who I am, right? I can just kind of tinker and make myself what it is that I want to be. And all the things that this is the kind of attitude people take ubiquitously about more or less everything, right? Seeing the world as an infinitely plastic medium where nothing is sufficiently sacred to be able to just exist as what it is. And I think, again, this is an insightful critique, right? Particularly for those of us who are of a religious bent, or at least interested in religion. There are insights that can be gleaned from it, even, of course, if I don't agree with his conclusion that one should adopt a conservative perspective on these issues.
Mm. And you close this piece calling for a politics of hope, which I mean is based on what I would say is a kind of optimistic view or reading of modernity or like the positive things that it offers up. So can you just say a little bit about, I don't know, what is most hopeful to you about modernity and how do you think we could get the most out of it? Like how would we be looking at it?
Well, in a lot of ways, I'm not very hopeful about post-modernity, as I call it, right? The reason I added that was a bit of shameless self-promotion, because I thought since I wrote a book on post-modernity, I should probably incorporate at least a few of my own ideas into this rather than just reiterating what other people have to say. But in my book, The Emergence of Post-Modernity, I argue that one of the characteristics of post-modernity, as opposed to modernity, is that post-modernity is modernity, but without hope, without optimism.
Hmm.
The technical term that I use is there's a lack of time consciousness in postmodernity in the sense, and this is something that I actually draw from Heidegger, right? That we are sufficiently future minded, but not future minded purely in the phenomenological sense. I'm actually quite critical of this kind of phenomenological outlook that I see is quite ubiquitous in postmodernity, but in this historical sense, imagining that there is a better world that is possible. And this is where I was really influenced by people like Fred Jameson, Mark Fisher, right? All of whom famously claim it has become easier to envision the end of the world in postmodernity. We see it all the time on the big screen than to imagine an end to capitalism, right? I mean, fuck. Sorry. Uh, I watched Alien Romulus just the other day, right? And it was a deeply depressing film for me in a lot of ways, even though it's a pretty good alien movie, because I was like, we're going to wind up in the stars 400 years from now, and we're still going to have companies like Weyland Yutani exploiting us, forcing us to work hours that we don't want to, and everyone's going to be living in space trailers and stuff. And I think that this lack of a sufficiently historical time consciousness leads people to feel that a better world is not possible, and that induces either these feelings of passive nihilism, where we just acquiesce to the status quo without meaningfully trying to criticize it and work against it, or we embrace active forms of nihilism that suggest that if we can't change the status quo, at least we can break the world, burn it down, as it were. And these very often facilitate politics that are predicated on resentment. The exemplar of this that I give, of course, being something like Trumpism, right? Now, I know at least a few of your listeners might be a little angry at me characterizing Trumpism as a kind of resentment-driven politics.
No, they'll
Uh,
live.
yeah, well, they can take it up with Wendy Brown if they want. She's the main source I draw upon for this. But I'll just give a very good example of this from 2020, right? Article I cite several times. There was an article op-ed in the National Review, once a kind of stalwart in every Trump publication, but now has really shifted, and it's called "The Only Middle Finger Available," right? Uh, and the article was about just what you might think it would be about, right? Basically, the author says, "Yeah, Trump has his flaws. Yeah, he has, done a few bad things here and there, but he really pisses off the liberals, and he really pisses off the kind of liberal elites that dominate this country. And if I need to vote to him for him to give them the big middle finger, and then so be it, right? And these are the kinds of resentment, ressentiment-driven, active forms of nihilism that I think are really damaging, not just this country, but the world abroad. And I think a politics of hope that suggests a better world is possible. Not a utopian society, but one that builds upon and improves the best aspects of modernity and postmodernity while chucking what's bad about it. That's something that we can get behind and hopefully will inoculate us against a lot of these nihilistic tendencies.
Okay, so seeing as this kind of platform is dedicated to finding the cracks in postmodernity, in other words, the ways that postmodernism kind of opens the door to rediscovering that which is most true, that which is most human. Um, do you have any positive, like what positive things do you think postmodern thought does bring into the picture, if anything at all?
Well, I've never been somebody who thinks that that postmodern thought is all terrible, right? Uh,
Mhm.
if I'm being really honest with myself, one of the reasons why I became dissatisfied with it was beyond just its nihilism and all the substantive critiques. It's what I kind of learned when I went to college for in a lot of places, right? You used to call the university that I did my PhD at Foucault U, right? Because every class you took was, discourse theory, governmentality, biopolitics, disciplinary society. And I want to be clear. I think that there are insights that are worth gleaning from all the major authors that articulate and defend iterations of what we might call postmodern theory. And I want to be clear here. What I'm talking about by in terms of postmodern theory is not the same as the postmodern cultural condition, which I am ubiquitously and uniformly critical of. But what they think these postmodern theorists did was offer, to use the Hegelian term, an account of their own time in thought, which is something that I don't think is always sufficiently appreciated uh, both by conservatives and by some Marxists, even, right, who just don't like people like Foucault or Derrida, etc. I think that Foucault, Derrida, Spivak, Rorty all have serious philosophical problems underpinning their systems, but they do articulate novel forms of skepticism, whether about grand narratives or whether about, universalizing discourses, right? And their skepticism, in some cases, is insightful and leads one to adopt a more critical or even Socratic approach to presuppositions that one simply took for granted for a long period of time. Just to give one quick example that I myself have been inspired by for a long time, I think if you read a book like Discipline and Punish, right, I think even conservatives can get something that's of value from that, right? If they were to look at it carefully enough. Why? Because Foucault points out, look, there's this kind of teleologically minded meta narrative that centrist liberals like to embrace, which is the medieval era was absolutely terrible. The feudal system was a barbaric system. And look at how progressive and how modern and how ethical and how wonderful we are now, right? We've just advanced in every step kind of way from that. Now, Foucault, of course, is not a conservative. He does not argue for return in any way, shape, or form. But he really picks holes in that and says, actually, is it really all that humane to transition from a society where, yeah, you brutally slaughter a couple hundred people a year to reinscribe the power of the ancien regime, but then you imprison millions of people for decades of their lives in a prison industrial complex to try to extract value out of them? It's a pretty good question to ask, and it's the kind of question that only a postmodern theorist I think could ask in as probing a way as Foucault. So I'm not I'm not a two cheers for postmodern theory kind of person, let alone three cheers. But I'm willing to give it one cheer because I think that it's useful and worth thinking through if you give it a chance.
Okay, so then the other side of this for me is like on paper, I agree with all of the points you're making in this article. Like I agree that, you know, modernity does open the door to, what Taylor says, like this kind of this ethic of authenticity, which sure has its flaws, but like there's something more true about that than like people just blindly following whatever kind of formalistic ideal. And also like yeah, the reactionary return is in addition to being kind of impossible, is I don't know, it lacks by virtue of being a reaction, it doesn't offer an actual proposal. It's not even traditional in the true sense of the word because
No,
you're kind of imposing something of your own making rather than trying to draw on something that organically is kind of rooted in the past. But I have to say, maybe because of my temperament or for some other reason, like I am more drawn to the pessimistic or apocalyptic reading of modernity and to, I don't know, like as much as yes, again, on paper, I will acknowledge all these positive things, and I rather be living in the modern world than in a medieval one. Um, I'm still inclined to criticize it very heavily because I think for me, I don't like when people paint it to be like, oh yes, in the Hegelian sense, like everything's great now, and it's not like those dark ages when people were, uh, it's as much as yes, there is good here. I think to paint it as like completely idealistic, it's like you're obscuring the truth and you're kind of robbing us of a language to speak about modernity's flaws. Um, so I guess I have this kind of like love-hate relationship with it. But I don't know, like I'm curious to hear your thoughts though on this kind of like this struggle, this drama of understanding that yes, ultimately there's something good here, but I don't want to treat it as if it's like our salvation, that it has all our it's solved all of our problems. You know what I mean?
oh, without a doubt, right? So look, this is I wouldn't say not even. I would say this is beyond just the kind of psychological issue. It's also a spiritual issue, right?
Yeah,
And people have
ultimately
different
it
kind of
is.
psychological and spiritual orientations that they bring to bear when analyzing the discourse. Let's just use the Hammurabian term around modernity and postmodernity. And I want to acknowledge, right, that I myself can give in to those more pessimistic, gloomy, even apocalyptic sensibilities at points, right? Uh, Including, when I wrote my book, The Rise of Postmodernity, or sorry, The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, right? I have a lot of bad feelings about Trumpism. So I think that just to speak on the left end of things, because that's where I think there's a little bit more that's of interest to say, since pretty ubiquitously, like I said, conservative critiques tend to be gloomy about modernity, right? Uh, you don't see a lot of sincere conservatives, not classical liberals, but sincere conservatives saying, three cheers for the modern world or something like that, right? Uh, but leftists have always tried very hard to adopt this kind of Marxist dialectical approach to modernity and now postmodernity that holds, first off, that before you critique, you have to understand. And secondly, that it is important to simultaneously hold to the idea that modernity is and capitalism, the most progressive, advanced social form that has existed thus far, and the worst, most regressive, most destructive social form that has existed thus far, and try to find a way to reconcile that in thought before you move to practice and trying to change the world to get rid of the bad in order and keep the good, right? And some inevitably what happens, and I think this is an inherent problem with Marxism, right, is people tend to align with one side of this dialectic over the other effectively, which is
Yes.
why nobody is very good at doing it perfectly, including myself, right? So in the 20th century, as we know, many people embraced what purportedly was a scientific version of Marxism, but without a doubt was ultimately a kind of millenarian view of Marxism, right? This idea that the science of history had shown that the victory of the proletariat was inevitable, capitalism was good enough for now, but it was inevitably going to fall away and be replaced by, a society where the free development of each was a condition for the free development of all, and the development of human powers would be an end in itself for the first time, right? And very clearly, that is not what came to pass with the advent of the authoritarian command economies, with all their kind of vulgarities and atrocities, et cetera, et cetera. Even though I think that there's a lot of good thing that emerged from socialist movements of the 20th century as well, about social democracy, right? So what you've seen since then has been that most Marxists actually have emphasized the much more pessimistic, gloomy, even fatalistic qualities of the dialectic of modernity and postmodernity. Just to give one example of a figure that we didn't talk too much about, Mark Fisher, right, who some of your authors, your readers might know, uh, was very overt about the fact that a lot of his feelings of depression and despair, and it's really can only be called despair in the true Kierkegaardian sense, emerged from the fact that he felt that there was no light at the end of this tunnel, right? That the dialectic had kind of run its course. The worst features of modernity now, postmodernity, had become ascendant, and there was no teleological or Marxist guarantee that things were going to get better rather than getting worse. And of course, we all know that tragically, he ended up taking his own life shortly after the election of Trump, precisely because he gave in to a lot of those worst impulses, right? So I'm not sure how any good leftist can satisfactorily inhabit both of these kinds of affective and spiritual forms of orientation towards modernity at the same time without running into very serious problems, right? This idea that modernity has many beneficial sides to it that should be carried forward, while at the same time an extraordinarily corrosive, destructive side that needs to be eliminated. I think there's invariably going to be this push or this tug towards one side of that or the other. But myself, I try to be I try to thread that needle as closely as I possibly can. Whether I do a good job or not, of course, is up to readers and listeners.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, first off, like the kind of spiritual dimension of it, like I have to, whenever talking about this, like I think I have to contextualize it within, my own history, my own experience. Because like growing up, yeah, like I think all I knew was like I grew up in a completely modern framework. Like I never, like my family was not particularly religious, didn't hold on to that many traditions from, their own families. So I think my kind of pessimistic, apocalyptic temperament as a reaction to only knowing this kind of modern framework and thus being very much acquainted with its inadequacies. And like you said, its inability to kind of account for certain spiritual needs, like some kind of need for salvation that, my rational will or, the democratic state can't grant to me. Um, and that being said, though, like I think my biggest hang up about modernity is like what I perceive to be a deceptiveness about it, because again, it does present itself as this kind of salvific, all-encompassing kind of proposal when, like as you said, there is this dark side to it. There comes a lot of violence, a lot of suffering, and I think you're never going to find any kind of system of thought or politics of governance where there isn't a dark side, where there isn't suffering. I just don't like that in general. The modern thinkers, the modern philosophers, like tend to kind of obscure that side of it. And it's the deception that makes me most concerned. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Oh, I absolutely do. So I have a lot of different things to say about this. I'll start off with an olive branch to people on the right. So many of your listeners are probably familiar with Patrick Deneen, right?
Yes.
So I have a lot of problems with Pat Deneen. I've made those very clear. Although every time we've interacted, which isn't very often on Twitter, it's been polite, which is nice. It's pretty rare on Twitter these days. But I think his best book is a book called Democratic Faith, which draws actually, I'd say quite a lot more blood than his book, Why Liberalism Failed. So, in Democratic Faith, Deneen quite rightly chastises many progressives for adopting what can only be described as a kind of perfectionist faith in egalitarian or democratic reforms. This idea that we're not only going to create a more humane society or a society that looks after the needs of the poor and the disadvantaged more effectively, we're going to improve human beings so completely that they are perfected in certain kinds of ways. And I think that Deneen points out very, very, very persuasively that this is a through line that runs through many aspects of progressive thought from the very beginning, through the works of people like Walt Whitman and John Dewey, and I would say exemplified in the thinking of people like Leon Trotsky, right? Leon Trotsky used to famously say that the soul of man under communism was going to become so elevated that ordinary people would become, Marx, Goethe, and Aristotle, and beyond that, new heights would arise, right? I personally do not hold to that view at all, right? My view of human nature is fundamentally Augustinian in the sense that I think we are all flawed, right? And we're irredeemably flawed in certain kinds of ways. Certainly not without God intervening to take away all of our worst inclinations. Are we ever going to see those flaws disappear, right? Uh, but I would argue that that is actually a good reason to adopt a kind of more left approach to things like power and politics, et cetera, et cetera. Rather than kind of arguing for, let's call it democratic or liberal socialism, on the basis that I think that this is going to perfect human beings and all of our sins and sinful inclinations are going to wash away. I think that what we really need to recognize is that as long as human beings are invariably sinful, the temptations of power, including economic power, are invariably going to lead to corruption. So a society that eliminates concentrations of power, including the concentrations of power that emerge from wealth, is one that people are going to be far less capable of giving in to their worst inclinations than what we see right now in, say, what people call American democracy, but when it is very close to a kind of plutocratic kind of society, right? So my view is that if we were to advance towards a liberal socialist or democratic socialist future, it would have to be done on the understanding that not everyone is going to live a happy life, because I think there are very serious limitations to what political and economic reform can do, right? Many people are going to still feel spiritual yearning, anxiety about death, feel anger at the inauthenticity of people around them, not being able to form meaningful romantic connections. And there's really not very much beyond a certain point that we can do about that, right? A liberal socialist society, on my perspective, could make it far easier for you to take time off, for example, to attend church, to try to marry, the girl or boy of your dreams, whoever it happens to be. But they can't. But political reform cannot go in there and make you into a good husband or a good Christian, right?
Mm.
That is something that you yourself are going to have to develop, which may be why virtue ethics has something to it, right? Something I've been thinking about a little bit recently, but I don't want to get too much into that because it's an underdeveloped thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's one of the most compelling arguments that I think someone could make for it. But so, okay, to wrap things up, I do want to ask you because I find it interesting that, I mean, sure, like you say that you're, you lean more towards the left and you write mostly for left-leaning publications, but I find it interesting how you engage very generously with thinkers who lean on the right, but also like you've written for publications that lean right. Why is that important to you to have that kind of cross-partisan engagement? What value do you see in doing that?
Well, it's funny you say that. There are a lot of people on right wing Twitter who really hate me. I know because they tweet at me all day long, saying that I'm deeply unfair to what they have to say. Now, I want to be clear. I hold, let's call it the fascist or Nazi right, especially the alt right, in contempt, and I find it very hard not to be not to be fair to them, because I think I am fair to them, but to be generous, because I don't think there's very much that one could say generously about their outlooks. But I have a lot of respect for other kinds of right wing thinkers and other right wing modes of thought, because I think there's no denying, if you were to read the canon of reactionary and right wing thought, that while there are a lot of cranks and kooks and loons in it, like there are on the left, right, there are some really deep, thoughtful, persuasive thinkers, people like Edmund Burke. People like Deneen, people like Lawler, Nietzsche, right? List goes on and on and on. And I've always thought to myself that it's a serious mistake for leftists not to appreciate the depth of right wing thought, or probably even worse, to assume that the only reason why people on the right hold the views that they do is because they're self serving rationalizations for their own egotism and their own selfishness, right? I'm thinking here of excuse me, Ted Hondrick's or John Kenneth Galbraith's famous descriptions of conservatism as just kind of rationalized selfishness or intellectualized selfishness, right? I think that it's very clear if you read the best of right wing thought that many people on the right sincerely believe in what they are doing, and they have good reasons to hold to a lot of convictions that they do. I'm talking about the best people in that tradition, right? And so rather than just dismissing that, I think it is worthwhile to learn from it, engage with it, and to try to persuade people that some of those convictions might need to be dropped or are worth dropping, but a lot of those convictions could be better realized if they were to transition towards adopting a more kind of progressive view on issues like liberalism or on issues like socialism, right? Uh, and I suppose just personally, I kind of got tired of inter-left fighting. uh, there's only so many fucking articles you can write about why a Marxist approach to Foucault is important, because Foucault can't actually advance left-wing causes sufficiently by himself without historical materialism before you're like, oh God, right? Who am I speaking to? I just wanted to kind of see what the other side had to say and engage with it because it just seemed more intellectually stimulating to me. I want to be clear, I've never regretted that, right? I do think it is more intellectually stimulating to actually have those big picture debates rather than these more nebbish, scholarly, even scholastic kind of debates about internal political and philosophical disputes.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, like as you said, it's more efficient. It's more practical to kind of have that attitude rather than an antagonistic one, because then ultimately you're just going to be speaking to the choir rather than, I don't know, trying to get more people to understand your point of view and perhaps to win them over to it. Yeah, so if you haven't read the article already, you should check it out on our Substack. And a reminder that Matt's book is coming out next month. So Matt, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve. And yeah, great chat. And I really appreciate good questions, right? It's not often I get the chance to talk about modernity and postmodernity anymore, so I really appreciated the opportunity.
Of course.